Hello, and welcome back to the Dr. Mia Paquin podcast. This week, we are joined by Dr. Todd Wilkinson, who is going to be telling us a little bit about undergraduate studies at the University of Wisconsin River Falls in psychology, as well as his own areas of expertise in health and sports psychology. Welcome, Dr. Wilkinson.
Thanks, Mia. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us. As we get going here, can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
I've been at River Falls for longer than I would like to admit, I think. My areas are health psychology and sports psychology. I played sports, and I realized that studying sports psychology, I wish I would have known. It would have been very helpful for me. I feel like I have kind of a natural tendency as a teacher, and it just fits really well. I love learning, and that's kind of what got me into being a professor too, because it's just continually learning and all of that. I didn't know that I wanted to be a professor when I was a student. So students that are listening, if you don't have it figured out while you're in school, you're not alone. Even us older individuals here that have our careers kind of mapped out didn't always have that be the case.
How did you get interested in psychology in particular? You mentioned that sometimes people have no idea kind of what they're going to be doing, while they're going to college. How did you decide on psychology?
I originally majored in economics as an undergrad, and but I just have such an interest in people and understanding how we think and how we influence each other and interact with one another and all of that. So it just was a natural fit. I probably got exposed to it initially from my mom, who was a school psychologist. So, and I didn't really know it at the time, but I think that, you know, kind of played a role in kind of getting introduced to psychology and things like that. I think for better or worse, I think I'm in my head a little bit, probably too much. It's interesting to look at what is the science behind that rather than just kind of making my own assertions and things like that. And so it's just a natural fit for me. And then just loving to teach is great.
Absolutely. Wow. Yeah. And I think, the other day I was thinking, as a psychologist, it's almost hard to imagine what we were thinking about before we were psychologists because now we think about the thoughts that we have and, oh, how does that fit? But you've always been someone who's been pretty introspective and also some early influences from having a mom who's a school psychologist. Tell us a little bit about the courses that you're teaching at the University of Wisconsin River Falls.
Well, I teach some really fun classes. I teach the careers in psychology class, which I think we'll talk about a little bit more. Which I really really enjoy that one. My two areas I think I mentioned are health psychology and sports psychology, and I love those two classes as well. Um, I teach research methods, and there's some aspects of that class where it feels good. One of the things that's about psychology, as I think some of your listeners will be familiar with, is that it's not always cut and dried. And teaching research methods, there are some more somewhat black and white kinds of topics that we get into, and that is kind of a nice break from some of the more abstract kind of stuff. So, um, I'm currently teaching a personality psychology class, which is really interesting. So I get a variety. I teach a lot, and there's parts of all the classes that I really enjoy.
And I imagine you have to know a lot of different areas of psychology to teach all these different courses.
Yeah, that's a big challenge is trying to keep up with the current research because I do kind of have my toes in different areas, but it's also something that I really enjoy. I'm kind of a nerd. I kind of get in
Love nerds.
I kind of get into research articles and so it's something that I think that's one of the things about my job that it doesn't feel like a job. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a lot of work, but I'm learning. I continually learn. But you're right too. It is a challenge about trying to keep currents in a number of different areas. So that's a good bad kind of situation.
Some of the people who may be watching the podcast may be considering um, going to college for a degree in psychology. And, as I'm sure you know, psychology is one of the most popular undergraduate degrees that people seek. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's a great question. I think we all have a natural curiosity. I mean, psychology, I tell or ask my students whether this is the only psychology class you take or you're a psychology major, what would you possibly do you know, that doesn't involve people? There's a natural interest to it, a curiosity. I mean, we've got all sorts of brilliant theories and things that we talk about, but it's such an applied discipline. That's one of the things I really emphasize with my students is that regardless of what class I'm teaching, all of it you can apply to your everyday life. There's things that you can take and use today. So I think that's really what gets a lot of students interested in it. Yeah.
Yeah, no matter what field you're going into or what you're doing in your personal life, psychology is going to be useful. Many of the kind of general population think when somebody's going to school for psychology that they must be going because they want to be a therapist or a clinical psychologist. Can you tell us a little bit more about the different areas of psychology that students might study?
You're exactly right. A lot of students, their first thought in psychology is to be a therapist. And that is the most popular kind of career interest of students. But psychology is so broad. I mean, we've got a department of 10 instructors, and we all do something different. And some of it is very different, right? So I've got colleagues that do work with in neuroscience. And so they're studying the nervous system, particularly, of course, the brain, and they're getting into the neurotransmitters and hormones and different structures of the brain. And I've got a colleague that does EEG studies and so forth. And I teach my class and I'm talking about sports and performance enhancement and how to get kids a better experience in sports and things like that. So some of the different areas outside of the clinical counseling area, social psychology, and that's a really popular area for students too. Social psychology is basically the influence of people on each other, right? And the way we think and the way we perceive the world. And social psychology is everywhere, right? You can use that information to help with understanding your own relationships and things like that. One of my colleagues that teaches social psychology, her expertise is in prejudice and racism, and she teaches a class on that. And so really important topics that I think sometimes students don't really realize. Some of the other areas, developmental, another really popular area. We're kind of studying the physical, emotional, cognitive development over time from birth in the womb, basically, through the lifespan, which is so important with all of the different areas to have that understanding developmentally. Industrial organizational psychology. A lot of students, when they come to our university, haven't heard of industrial organization, which is basically psychology of the workplace, psychology of business, and helping organizations be more efficient, helping to select employees, better training procedures, things like that. Cognitive psychology, studying things like memory and thinking and decision making and all of that kind of stuff. Well, health psychology, I didn't mention too much yet, but my area where we talk about stress and not only psychologically, but also physiologically, what's going on in our brains and our bodies and how we think and how we feel and how we behave all interact with one another in different ways to shape. And then very importantly, what we can do about it. And boils down in sometimes into that voice in our heads. Two people can experience the same stressor. One is telling themselves something, and someone is telling themselves something else, and our body's going to react very differently, right? So we get into that. We get into health and wellness. Some of my research gets into mindfulness practice and looking at that effects on well-being and things like that.
Well, and when we started too, just, your own family having a school psychologist and the whole educational psychology piece of things. I mean, it's hard to think of an area, um, that psychology is not a part of, right?
Yeah.
Or a career.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, I should also mention on our campus, we have, 2 master's programs that interest a lot of our students, and one of them is school psychology, and the other is school counseling. Every year, we have some of our students apply into those programs, and they're in really high demand. The directors of those programs have basically said, you get a degree and there's a job for you. I think school psychology, I think the placement rate has been 100% out of their program for years. So
Wow.
there's such a demand, school psychology. So we don't have a specific, it's more of a graduate level. Uh,
Sure.
but undergraduate, developmental psychology, all the different classes that we offer really provide a good foundation for students who want to go into school psychology as well as school counseling too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And River Falls, just, I mean, impressive programs at the undergrad, grad level, just such great programs. Um, that kind of leads into a question that a lot of people consider when they're majoring in psychology is, if I get a degree in psychology, does it mean I have to go on to graduate school in order to have a career?
I can't count how many times I've had a student tell me, especially in my careers class where we really kind of get into this. When I tell people I'm a psychology major, they say, well, you're going to grad school then, right? So the short answer is more than half of psychology undergraduate majors don't go to grad school. And presumably they're gainfully employed and doing
Yeah.
something, right? And so I again reiterating kind of how are you not going to use psychology in your career, in your life? What I also tell students though, and I would really want to be upfront with students about this, is that if you're taking classes in psychology where you're getting into some topics and learning about what a psychologist does, and that's the career path you want to take, then you really are going to be thinking about grad school. Psychology provides a lot of skills, the major. I think it also attracts students that have particular skill sets in the first place. Through some of my work and research in the careers class, these are a lot of the skills that employers in all sorts of different areas are looking for. I've read and I've heard that, employers are saying, well, we can train you how to do A, B, and C at our organization, but it's much harder to train you how to work well with people. So from that aspect, having the background in psychology provides some skills that are really in demand for a lot of careers. That being said, it's not the most direct route to career. So
Yeah.
if you want to be an accountant or if you want to be a nurse and so forth, right, you can have a direct career path and you know where you're going. And with psychology, because it's so broad and diverse, it doesn't set you up in a kind of linear path. There's a little bit more kind of ambiguity to it, but a lot of our students kind of enjoy that flexibility.
Yeah. Well, and I think at that age too, when if you're going to college right after high school, you may not know and you might want to leave a lot of doors open because, if you go down a specific route for a certain career and then you get there and you don't like it, then it can be really hard to shift.
I absolutely, absolutely. I think that flexibility, and I really encourage my students to explore. I mean, that's one of the great things about college is you've got all of these different things going on campus. And there's so many, different disciplines where you can learn all this great information, and you can just take a class here, take a class there, or some of them based on purely what looks interesting. It's such a great time to explore and learn what's out there. And I think a lot of students end up finding out what they end up really are passionate about, to use a overused term maybe, but is something that they didn't even know about.
Yeah,
They came
yeah.
to school.
Are there some, careers that come to mind for, psychology undergrad majors that they're able to go into, right out of their undergraduate degree?
Might sound unusual, but nationally, some of the biggest areas that undergraduate psychology majors go into with the bachelor's degree are things like business, going into working in organizations and things like that. There's a whole range of different areas. What psychologists do, right, often is going to require graduate school, but a lot of the work that is part of a team. So
Yeah.
with a bachelor's degree, you might not be directing that team, but you are a part of that team, and you're going to have your roles and responsibilities. And so we have students that get into all forms of different types uh, of work. And we've got students that, and psychology overlaps with so many different areas, as yeah, I know you're familiar with. And so we have students that get into things that kind of overlap with social work,
Oh, okay.
overlap with things like sociology. We have a number of our students go into work that kind of looks more like case management work, where you're working directly one on one with clients in the community, not providing therapy that would require graduate school, but you're providing some really important services and helping them connect people and enrich their lives. We've got students that, like I said, business is a big one. Students that go into healthcare, and the healthcare industry is booming. And so we've got a lot of students that do that. Some of our students go off in paths and decide they want to go into education. They might be somebody who assists within a school or different types of things. So there's all sorts of different careers. I guess in general, part of what the graduate degree affords you is, if you are interested in the clinical and counseling, you absolutely need to have that advanced training. I mean, that
Okay.
is one of the realities of psychology, is that a bachelor's degree just doesn't, we don't have the time in even though it's 4 years to really properly train somebody to be working with, mental health concerns and so forth. But you
Yeah.
might be able to assist in that. And so
Yeah.
part of it is how directly you want to be working with clients. Do you want to be more in the kind of director of some of this, or do you want to be more in terms of providing assistance in a role or things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and certainly as a clinical psychologist, we see a lot of bachelor prepared individuals who might work in roles like a psychiatry tech on an inpatient unit or a psychometrist who administers psychological tests to our clients. And then in the community at a paraprofessional or kind of a, not a clinician level, but providing a lot of emotional and community support to clients as they're working with a team of, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, others, but really being able to provide the in-home or on the ground support for them. Um,
Absolutely, absolutely. And another area of psychology I haven't mentioned is forensic psychology.
yeah.
Um, I'll just make a brief note about this as in terms of clarification. Uh, so a lot of students come in with an interest in forensic psychology with the assumption that it means they're going to be a criminal profiler.
Ah,
Now that's those jobs are few and far between, but it is a field that we have a lot of our students interested in, and there's a lot of different areas to it. Some of our students really want to work in corrections. Some of our students that really want to work with it's not a therapeutic role, but working with a prison population in terms of a teaching, educational standpoint, things like that. Other students are interested in working within the legal system and all of that. So it's another area of interest. It's not really what it looks like on Criminal Minds and all those TV shows exactly. But we have a lot of students that are interested in that as well.
We just had a forensic psychologist on the show,
Oh,
and,
okay. So
yeah,
just
yeah.
just defer to the expert there. Have
Well,
viewers watch that podcast if they're interested in forensics.
yeah. I mean, but there are. I mean, there's so many different, areas of psychology I think each one is interesting in their own way and, probably hard sometimes for your students to even figure out, "Okay, which direction do I wanna go?" With all these choices. So,
Honestly, it can be overwhelming sometimes for students, and that's part of what the careers class is helping them really give them some focus and some time to reflect and explore.
let's switch a little bit and let's go a little bit deeper into sports psychology because I know that's kind of your passion. Tell me a little bit about what a sports psychologist would do.
A variety of different things.
Mhm.
A number of sports psychologists are academics, and so professors that may teach some classes, but also do a lot of research in sports psychology. So there's some great research out there looking at youth development through sports and how can we train and teach so that kids are getting more kind of character building, positive experiences in sports, and broadly more physical activity. So that's one big area, which really overlaps with my other big interests, which is health
Mhm.
psychology. Um, Now, where a lot of the money is today
Mhm.
is in performance enhancement. And what a lot of people are realizing is that sports is a big part mental. So the Yogi Berra has had a great quote that baseball is 90% mental and the other half is physical. He was, I think, very much right. Sports are very mental, as you might imagine. That some of these professional teams have a little bit of money, and if they can hire somebody to work with their athletes to help them perform under pressure more consistently, they might be willing to do that. In the last, I would say 15 years, it's gone from professional sports teams having a sports psychologist or maybe referring some of their athlete to a local person to do sports psychology. And now it's just everywhere. And there's teams of sports psychologists that are working with teams. There's sports psychologists, at the Division I level, again, pretty much widespread. Um, but there's also a lot of sports psychologists that are working with youth. Some of them many at the high school level, some of them even younger than that, which I've got my reservations about how early to do that. It's oftentimes I tell my students that the mental skills that we teach in terms of performance enhancement um, are no substitute for physical practice, but it's about getting the most out of your practice and your hard work and your talent, especially when the pressure's on. And that's really the role that sports psychology plays. In fact, the field itself really is much more broad. And so sports psychologists are also working in a variety of different areas. Sports psychologists work with CEOs of organizations to help them better in terms of their performance. They help surgeons so that when they go into the surgical OR that they're on their game and can perform. They help musicians and other performers. So it's really broad. And one of the things I
Yeah.
emphasize with my students, because I do get students that some of them aren't interested in sports and they take my
Yeah.
class. You can use the performance that we talk about, my mental skills, any performance. You're applying for a job, you can use these skills. You're studying for an exam, taking an exam, you can apply these skills. And so it really is. quite a broad field.
I feel like it's such a great opportunity to, take a proactive role in helping people, to develop these skills, right? Because they're gonna have a better performance, whether it's at work or whether it's on a baseball field, um, rather than just dealing with the after effects if they have something go wrong or they're not meeting performance expectations.
And Mia, I'm sure you're much more
Yeah,
familiar with this than I am. Just how many people these days are experiencing anxiety, and
yeah.
with all the stressors, obviously that we're facing and so forth. And so, for much broader than performance, I think some of these mental skills allow for greater enjoyment of
Yeah,
what you're involved with as well, to kind of, in some ways, help proactively, like you said, prepare for these kind of stressful situations that we get into.
absolutely. And I know you had talked about doing some research on mindfulness, and certainly in today's world with the levels of anxiety and depression, and then research coming out now showing that our ability to pay attention for periods of time has dwindled. Um, it makes that work so much more important. One of the things I'm wondering about is if you have any interesting stories of your time working as a sports psychologist.
I have a lot, um, and so I've worked with athletes and coaches and teams in a variety of different sports. And so my background is, I played baseball and basketball, and but I've worked with uh, pole vaulters and it's really interesting for me to learn about this, and also for viewers to understand that these mental skills, they're really the same across different sports. So although I'm not an expert in pole vaulting by any means, um, the same skills in terms of managing, being able to relax under pressure, how to really focus on what it is that you can control in a situation. Those mental skills can really be applied across a variety of sports. I worked with pole vaulters and just learning about just really how scary that sport can be, where you're launching yourself into the air like that. I worked with an equestrian athlete, and I loved hearing about the connection between her and her horse, and
Wow.
how there was just the slightest movements that of her body language the horse could interpret. And so it was really fascinating. I just really enjoyed it. So, and then just hearing about different experiences. I'm not a runner. And I think that's probably part because I'm not good at it, but it's also in part because my sports, that was always the punishment. So if you
Yeah.
did something wrong, then you have to go run, right? But I've worked with a lot of runners, especially distance cross country runners, and just the mental game that goes on, and just how much they push themselves and are able to push past pain and
Yeah.
all of that is fascinating. Yeah. And so just a variety of different areas. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And and very cool that the same kind of skill set might apply depending, regardless of what sport you might be engaged in, right? So,
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, been going to a conference on sports psychology for years, and they usually have sports psychologists there that work with the Olympic teams from all over the world, as well as those working with professional teams. And it's really interesting to hear how, at the Olympic level in the United States, you have some of the teams, the sports psychologists will be working with the team, and the sports psychologist initially really doesn't have a background in that sport. They need to do some homework and be able to catch up so that they can talk the talk and understand the language.
is there any difference in terms of what you might do with someone who's playing kind of an individual sport that's just them versus team sports where they're having to cooperate and work together?
Oh, it can be so different at times. Um, one of the things that a lot of the individual sports affords, because it's usually kind of what we call more of a closed environment where there's maybe less kind of things broadly to focus on. You can focus more narrowly in some cases. A lot of those individual sports afford you a lot of time to think. Whereas some of the team sports, oftentimes you've got a ball or you've got something that's moving and everybody's moving. And so, in some ways, it occupies your brain where you're not thinking quite as much sometimes. The training with athletes can be different, where it can be much more proactive, where you're planning. You're a golfer, you're planning, okay, what am I going to think about when I'm walking to my ball to hit my next shot? Right? And what's gonna be helpful for that versus the basketball player
Yeah.
where it might be a matter of, okay, so when I start going in my head too much, how do I get back into the game? And then the whole environment that's going on with all my teammates and my opponents and all of that kind of stuff. There's
Yeah, and really different skills that you have to have cognitively, a deep focus versus an ability to really kind of switch your attention back and forth between multiple different
that
things.
attentional flexibility is a big one and something that was not a skill of mine, a strong skill of mine playing where you focus externally and then really quickly then focus internally and that kind of thing. Really fun to see athletes that are good at doing that.
And, such a change in sports from, we don't talk about emotions, we don't recognize emotions, just suck it up and get on the field and play hard versus like now, like, wait a minute, we had it all wrong. We need to redo this. And that's actually where our advantage is the more that we're able to know and learn about.
That's another huge part of sports psychology I haven't even touched on is coaching and just kind of the old school model of coaching. And while there are benefits, and it's a model that does work for some athletes, particularly in terms of performance necessarily, maybe
Mhm.
not enjoyment all the time. We're really understanding better the costs of that model and trying to incorporate different ways of coaching and different ways of reaching athlete that might be in uh, maybe a not so authoritarian coach to player relationship
Yeah.
sometimes. So, and understanding everybody's different too.
Do the sports psychologists work with the coaches too sometimes to help them, have
Absolutely.
individualized strategies? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's another big part of it too. So coaches will have work with sports psychologists, um, try to understand how they can better connect with athletes. Maybe they're having a particular issue on a team, and they want to work with a sports psychologist. Maybe they want to get feedback. One of the things is that I know I've done a little coaching myself is you're so focused on the athletes. Sometimes you don't even think about, how what reactions that you're having from the players, right? And how
Yeah.
you are kind of presenting yourself sometimes. And so a sports psychologist can be a great way of somebody giving you that feedback and reflection and then kind of being more thoughtful about, okay, that didn't go so well. How could I change and deliver that message in a different way next time?
Yeah. Oh, so exciting, how sports psychology has really taken off and so many different directions, and I guess maybe it won't even be sports psychology a few years from now, it'll be, I don't know, performance enhancement or whatever it might be as musicians and others.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
In fact, you're ahead of the game. It's actually the field is starting to go by STEP, SEPP, which is sport, exercise, and performance psychology.
oh,
So,
wow,
so you might
okay.
start seeing that acronym a little bit more than just plain sports psychology.
And as we're talking about things changing in the field, one of the things we've been talking on our podcast about is the role of AI. I think everybody's talking about AI right now, artificial intelligence, and just, there's a lot of um angst and anxiety about, is AI gonna take away my job? What is the world gonna look like in the future? I know it's very speculative and certainly, no one has any answers right now, but, um, are there conversations happening, at the undergraduate level about how this might impact students as they're earning their degrees and what they might need to know about AI to be successful?
Oh, it is a huge topic, being discussed all the time, and in a lot of different contexts. In terms of the career landscape, AI is here, and it's going to play a big role, and none of us probably know how big of a role that's going to be. And so, I think in terms of psychologists, that I think we're already seeing some organizations use AI in a clinical context, which seems a little scary to me, to be honest. And
Yeah,
I should start with the caveat that I'm not an expert in AI for your viewers. What I have seen and what I have read is that there seems to be at this point in time with AI, some of the value is kind of distilling huge data sets and
yeah,
really being able to pull out relationships, connections between variables and things that would otherwise take a really be very data intensive, it'd take a really long time. I've seen in a kind of a clinical context where one study here, one study there,
yeah.
that certain AI programs can help with training clinicians, not replacing them, but with training and being able to break down in a therapeutic session for a trainee and say, you used very little empathy in this session, and so you might want to think about, or your cognitive behavioral therapy, you didn't get into these couple aspects so much. And so it can be, I mean, obviously, I think we are familiar. It can be such a wonderful tool when used correctly, right? And so that's going to be a huge challenge. And I hope psychologists have a lot of input in terms of the ethical use of AI as well as we see what happens.
Yes, yeah, I mean, so many potentially good things, some potentially concerning things too that could happen out there, but, it's going to be really interesting, and I can't imagine psychology not being involved in this. I know we talked with Dr. Ken Abrams about just how virtual reality and the technologies that's coming with that will enhance some of our treatments for folks with PTSD. And you can already see it coming through some of these different systems online too, in terms of write your notes with AI for clinical sessions. So it'll be interesting to see. Does it help? Does it maybe, do we miss something in the process?
Once upon a time, I did a research study with Ken. That's really interesting.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
great.
I go back to, and again, this is um, not an expert speaking here when we're talking about AI by any means. But all of these questions, for me, it brings me back to the place of, okay, but who's checking on this,
Yeah.
right? So with all of this, that we can have these programs and AI can tell us A, B, and C, but does that make sense? Behind the scenes, right? Who are the people that are gonna be working with this to try to
Mhm.
make it the most effective and, again, ethical? I think that's a great role for psychologists.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like we've just developed yet another sub area of psychology, AI psychology. So you guys are gonna have to
You
start
might have just
recruiting.
coined a new phrase.
I think so. Is it possible that I missed asking you some important question or something you wanted to share with our viewers?
I guess, just a couple things that maybe I would add real quick for our viewers. These are things that, I think a lot of people might be familiar with, and is that psychology, it's a science. I think a lot of kind of people who are new to psychology often see more of the art of psychology than the science of it.
Yeah,
Where I'm talking about working with athletes, for instance, in sports psychology and how to help them perform better and so forth. Those interactions really are based on kind of well-tested, evidence types of practices. So it's not
right.
just pulling things out of a hat and seeing what works today. It's really being informed by, you know, experts in the field who have spent, in some cases, their entire careers really looking at how the importance of self-talk or focus. I go back to kind of the layperson understanding of mental imagery is this kind of visual image that you project in your head of a sport situation, and then you can help practice, and it can be really effective, but it's also really difficult. And what research has told us some really important things about mental imagery, and one of those is that to be really effective, you have to practice it a lot, and you have to try to use all of your senses, not just your visual sense. I have athletes think it sounds kind of crazy at first, but what does your sport smell like? What does your sport taste like? And then the taste might be their own sweat, and the smell might be a, gross locker room or things like that, but it might be the grass outside and so your brain cues into that, and the more you can recreate using all of your senses, the more impactful it can be. So it's psychology is everywhere, but the effective use of what we know really takes a little bit of thought and sometimes even some training and things like that to use it effectively. It's not just a bag of tricks that you can apply and pull out and voila, a problem solved.
Yes, I love that you brought up the science behind psychology because that's it exactly. I mean, we have these professors and graduate students doing important research that helps inform us, so we know what works and what doesn't. We don't have to, just go out there and try,
Yeah,
whatever we think might work.
yeah.
Um,
It's the
we-
interplay too. So as much as a psychologist might be an expert on their field, if they're working as a clinician, for instance, the individual is the expert on themselves. And so you've got two people that have this really important, these different areas of knowledge. How can they work effectively together? So with psychology, it's the training and the education and understanding the science behind it, but it's also, okay, now I need to learn from somebody because it's not in a vacuum, right? I need to
yeah.
learn from people who are the best experts on themselves, and together, that's where psychology really can be most effective in a lot of cases.
Yes, it's, so many different things, learning, watching, research, I mean, just everything comes together. Um, but it's so important because it informs everything, right?
Yeah.
Wow. I am so grateful to you for your time today. Um, Dr. Wilkinson works at the University of Wisconsin River Falls, which has the best undergrad psychology program. I can say that because I went to UWRF. And truly, there is not a better school to prepare folks for whatever area of psychology they're going into. And so I'm so honored to be able to have you on our show. And I just want to thank you again for all your expertise that you've shared with us today.
Oh, I appreciate that. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Mia.
And just a reminder to all our viewers out there, please make sure to like this episode as well as subscribe to our podcast. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those too. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.